I'm Morgan Motzinger, and I'm highly allergic to surface conversations. So let's dig deep. Together, we'll explore creating meaningful habits, deepening our relationships, and cultivating more hope for a better inner and outer life. This is the PS We Expire podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
I had the normal wounding any young person would have around just being raised by humans who are flawed and limited in their capacity to respond, feeling like there might be certain things that were wrong with me. I think we all have that. So I did too. And then part of the way I dealt with my early life sensitivity was to kind of be really distant from my family because I think I was empathic and not so sure about them in a way. And so the first person I was like obsessed with and just wanted to be as close to as possible was this young boy named Keith. I, devised all kinds of plots to make him my boyfriend, including like starving myself, which I'm not proud of, but it just shows the extent to which my little brain was like fixated on this young boy. And I did make him my boyfriend. And about a year and a half after that, or actually 2 years after that, he took his own life. And he, pulled me into that, kind of trapped me in his plan, if you will.
What age were you?
I was 14. We were both almost 15. And so as far as like, why am I spending my entire life focused on healing? By turning 15, I was like really eroded inside. My best strategy to survive this intolerable pain was to just go numb and to try to not feel anything and try to think, my way out of things. I also, for the first couple years, was plotting my own death. I tried to stop him from making that choice by saying I would also end my life. And I think around age 16, I realized, oh man, I've got problems. Like if anyone was out of my field of vision, or my geography, my sister went to college and I'm like, you're dead. I started this accidental relationship with a friend, romantic relationship, and we lived in different cities about an hour apart. When I didn't see him, I'm like, you don't exist. And so I finally realized I have a real problem and I'm not going to be able to build a life over this hole. And so I got into therapy at that point. I was a junior in high school and probably had my first big healing moment by 18 and I thought I was way further than I was, of course. And it was like a very big spiritual kind of like back to emotions, back to the beauty and color of life. But everything I've done in the last 8 years, let's say, everything with my podcast and my book and all of the teaching I'm doing now is really that it turned out I wasn't that healed at 18, that I would spend the next, it was 25 years. So that was, instead of 4 years later after this huge trauma, it was 25 years after this huge trauma that I spent kind of tirelessly pursuing my own healing, learning about healing. I got into Eastern religions and spirituality. I started grad school to be a psychotherapist professionally at age 24, was seeing clients by age 26. So I was a great, very skillful therapist, looking very, a yoga teacher, seeming okay from the outside and still kind of hobbling around with this like crippling core wound that something was wrong with me, and various kind of deep down pains. And so everything I've done in the last 8 years has really been what made the difference between compensated Rachel, who was like very good at her healing job, and this like experience that started, I noticed it in 2017, about 8 years ago, of this feeling of like, oh my God, I actually love myself. And I feel so resilient and so well. It was about a year after I left a non-viable marriage. And I had gotten very unique help in my journey to heal. Like the biggest influence on my work was this not therapeutic, but profoundly gifted, native initiated human. I don't use his name. He asked me not to, but he really kicked my butt, I'd say, and brought a level of understanding to my own healing journey that when combined with all the Eastern mysticism and all the therapeutic training, it really shifted things for me. And so what emotional potty training, the name of what I call my modality, which is, funny and makes it a little hard to share because people don't take it seriously, maybe, or they don't want to talk about poop for sure. But it's really like, what were the essential pieces that were absolutely necessary for my healing, but also for, the hundreds of clients I've worked with? Like, what actually needs to be part of a practice that will genuinely transform us into the best, most self-loving and resilient versions of ourselves? And I found, and I'll pause before I go into this because that's a whole other thing, but I found that using the metaphor of looking at how we relate to our poop, the digestion of our food and knowing how to move it, knowing how to respond to this signal from our body that it's time to move it, is the absolute clearest, best way for people to understand, how we need to relate to our feelings. And I'll just end by saying, being able to move the feelings through the body, being able to digest, past trauma by releasing the pain that we carry is absolutely half, if not like 3/4 of, I think, how I got here. And the other part being like really about how do I find the parts of me and reconnect with the parts of me that carry that pain. So it's been a lifelong endeavor. Like, it for sure is my purpose. And I think once, and I imagine you relate to this, once you've walked a path so scathing and like unimaginably painful, I think, those are the people I personally would want walking with me if I have to walk that path. Not the people that are like, I bet it'd be a good job to be a therapist, but like someone who's like transformed their own pain and catalyzed themselves into a place of wellness from going through hell and back. So
Yeah, I think it's the people who recognize the necessity of having that level of support for healing. I wanted to ask, so the correlation between like the potty training and the emotional movement isn't, it sounds like it's not so much based on like the Freudian idea of like, all of it goes back to potty training, but more so just the being able to give someone a real tangible everyday knowledge in their bodies of what it means to be able to move something, to alchemize something, for it to pass through us. Am I understanding that correctly?
yeah, it's a metaphor.
Yeah.
The way I bring it up with people is like, okay, when you got that urge today, maybe a couple times, maybe once, maybe not yet, but when
Certainly
you
after
got,
the coffee.
yeah, exactly, same. When you had the signal from your body that it was time to leave a poop, we say take, but we don't actually take it, we leave it. When you got that, did you try to eat or post something or check your likes on something or buy something or smoke something? Like, did you do anything else to move to not have that feeling? Or did you go to a bathroom and, take care of business? Which did you do?
Well, it kind of depends on like the environment that I'm in, but I would definitely be most focused on finding a place to relieve that.
Yeah. And that first piece you said is important also. So basically, we were potty trained, which means we were taught, that the only way to not have the feeling that we're full of poop is to go to a bathroom and deal with the poop. And emotions are incredibly similarly intense physical sensations that let us know something needs to move through the body. But our parents didn't know that, and most of them at least. And so we weren't necessarily taught, okay, you're feeling mad. You're allowed to feel mad. Why don't you go to your room and safely, go to the appropriate place, as you say, and safely move that through your body? Most of our parents, and I think everyone's doing the best job they can, it's incredibly hard to make space for every single feeling your child has. Like, as you know, as a parent, and I think other parents will know, it's like your child might melt down based on the color of their sippy cup. So like, of course you're like, oh my God, or you're trying to keep the kid alive and keep the roof over the head. It's like, it's very hard to just allow and support someone learning how to move their feelings. It's like, even the best of most loving parents were saying things like, shh, you're fine, or there's nothing to be afraid of. And then, of course, there are people who have more abuse or neglect where they might have been shamed for their feelings or told that, based on their gender expression, that they're not allowed to feel what they feel. There's all kinds of messages that everyone gets. But even best case scenario, even the most loving parents are going to try to help the kid not feel bad. And it's very natural and it's needed. Like, children don't have the capacity to regulate their emotions in the beginning. And, basically what that looks like is most people were trained out of feeling as like just the mechanism to resolve feelings. And so instead, maybe we were put in front of a screen, or we were given a treat, or we were threatened, you know. And so people are inclined to try to avoid emotions or medicate that hard feeling with like what I call the drug of choice. So it could be Netflix, validation, busyness, actual drugs, alcohol. So, and what happens is, people go decades like trying to not have their hard feelings or their bad feelings, the ones that they're uncomfortable with, the ones they were trained out of. And they instead are full of this unprocessed, backlog, and fairly mired in addictive patterns to try to avoid themselves. Like if you're not willing to feel yourself and your emotions, you can't really live in your body. You can't really be present, or else you might get a glimpse of your sadness or your fear or your anxiety. And so people are addicted and distracted and usually wreaking havoc on their lives by the time they realize maybe there's a different way. And it's very, we come to it honestly. No one taught us how, and it's, a human biological instinct to not want to have pain or to not want to suffer. The problem is that none of those alternatives to our emotional pain actually get rid of emotional pain. It just piles on more pain. Just like there's no way to not be full of shit other than to let the shit out. And so basically I've just found that, by using the metaphor of, learning to have your feelings like you have your poops, there's like an immediate understanding of, oh, I need to allow this out. Oh, like, and there's shame there. I think it's really important to choose something that makes us a little uncomfortable, because the part of us that feels like shit, and I hope it's okay that we use the word shit on your
Of course.
show. It's in my title. It's behind me. But the part of us that feels like shit, I think for most people is the thing they're most afraid of. But generally speaking, people aren't like, come see my big poop I left, or it's like private and for some people shameful that they shit. And so I'm using a bridge there of like, hey, we all poop. We know you poop. Guess what? We all have parts that feel like shit. And the only way for them to feel better is if they, learn how to bring the body back into this like regularity, which means, and in the beginning of that process, and we can break this down if, not in this exact moment, but in the beginning of like really going after your healing, that might be a very acute excavation where you're learning, how do I get back into this like stagnant backlog and get enough like connection, enough strength, enough ability to move these old, big, crusty things through me. That takes a lot of work. But the goal, once you do that, once you clear out what's there, once you bring in the parts that had to get repressed in order for you to get that far without having that pain, once you bring those parts in, once you clear out the backlog, the goal is that you just know how to respond to the emotional signal the way you would your bowel movement. It's not that you stay mired and obsessed with your emotional pain, but that you are in yourself enough to notice the signal when it comes and then to just deal with it appropriately, which is have it.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think many people who can feel the backlog and be like, I see that I need to be doing something different. I need to address these core wounds. I need to address these traumas from my childhood. But if I do, it's never going to stop. Like I'm going to be on the toilet forever because I'm just full of shit and it's never going to stop. And so I think that makes perfect sense why people are hesitant, because it does feel like, is there any end in sight? Because those first forays into the emotional depths can be extraordinarily overwhelming. And that's the thing that I wanted to ask you about is like when you first started, when your emotional digestive system first started to wake up, how did that not only feel, but like what tools did you have in place or supports you have in place to be able to learn how to move that old stuff through your body and how to continue to move stuff through your body going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I want to just speak more generically to people's fear first. What you were just saying about people think it won't end. It's absolutely so pervasive, that fear. And I'm like, I double dog dare you to try to cry for 5 minutes straight. For most of us, unless we're in the aftermath of acute loss, like death, breakup, something really intense, like what actually happens to most people, not everyone. And my book does address like who are the people who are swimming and feeling and always in feelings and never having relief. There are people like that, and everyone's afraid they'll be like that. Most people are the opposite, where the ability to sustain connection to the feelings is actually the harder part. Like they are more likely to lose connection or go numb or get distracted, even though they're afraid of the first thing. So I'll answer your question about me in two ways. When I first started feeling again as an 18-year-old, I would say the experience was like deeply spiritual, in that I felt like my soul had come back into my body, and I was kind of enchanted with like the magic and the synchronicity of life in this way of realizing how many different pieces came together to help me have the insight that kind of shifted things for me and helped me land back in my body. And I was also, 18 and about to go through a phase of smoking weed pretty regularly. And so, I think that there was just an ungrounded, but like deeply connected part of me. Like I was like, yeah, because I was still like barely in my body, it was like a huge healing had happened. Some part of me came back, and it was like so different, not only from, pre-trauma, pre-death, but really, I think I experienced myself in a different way than I had as a kid. It was a profound moment. But I think what you're really interested in is like, the secondary shift back into my capacity to digest my emotions, um, which I would say was, more of a product of my mid to late 30s. And the tools you're asking about, right? How did I do that? Is that what you want to know?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would say it was about creating practices of bringing my attention inside. And this is really like what's at the heart of this book I just wrote, which is, feel, heal, and let that shit go. It's like, it's like how learning how to slow down with myself, like bringing myself off of a hamster wheel of distraction, learning how to slow down with myself and how to actually be with myself in moments of feeling. Part of the container for me of this deepest work that I did with this mentor who I don't name was that I was in this marriage that really didn't work. Like we couldn't resolve any conflict. So as soon as there was, any escalation, and there was a lot of escalation, this person was like kind of like almost pathologically incapable of empathy. Like a lot of autism in the family. The parents were like, "Oh yeah, he's never had empathy." And was like very like happy to do whatever he wanted. So I was as immature as he was in the beginning of our partnership, thinking my feelings were his job. So as I was working with this mentor, kind of in constant agony emotionally, and what that would look like is something would get triggered for me. I would express some feelings at maybe like a 2 or 3. He would start to shut down and ignore me. I would escalate. He would shut down further. It ended up, I'm like ripping off very expensive t-shirts from my body and screaming. And he's like hiding in a laundry basket in a closet. Like it got gnarly. Like that was the backdrop that had me reach out for help. And basically, like, I learned how to, when I was feeling inflamed emotionally, how to step away versus offer my most tender parts to this person who was clearly not online himself, how to be with my feelings, and then how to start to actually create a practice, like an active practice around trying to move out my feelings. So, doing work like anger work was probably one of the most transformative practices. Like I would go into the woods and chop wood with an axe, like connect to the part of me that was angry and move it in this really physically intense way. I've brought a bunch of my clients to the woods to help them chop wood with an axe. It's not for everyone. There are simulated versions where you beat a bed with a towel, much safer. But things like that, like learning how to create a practice and a container around feeling my grief. So basically, like, in a way, it was learning how to come inside and then ritualizing, and not like in a witchy way, but like creating a container and a practice that would amplify my connection. So one of my favorite, metaphors teaching people like, well, why can't you feel your feelings? Is, when they back up, when we haven't been feeling our feelings for a really long time, or when something really awful happened to us, we need a really strong connection to ourselves and something beyond ourselves, generally speaking, to be able to move that big feeling through. And I think it's a good metaphor to look at like Wi-Fi bandwidth. Like if you go to the airport and you didn't download your film onto your device, it doesn't matter. You could be at the airport for 10 hours. It's not going to get onto your device because it's just not strong enough. That free, shitty airport Wi-Fi will never help you get the big file onto the thing, right? So you need strong, like, connection in order to move something big through you. And so a lot of what I'm teaching people is how do you use nature and music and containment, and like triggers, like how do you actually amplify your bandwidth? And one of the things I am as a therapist is a Wi-Fi hotspot for people's feelings. And people generally orient toward other humans to amplify their capacity, their bandwidth. And so someone has a hard day, they call their partner, or and then they start to cry, right? Or they people won't feel their feelings until they're in connection. Now that's powerful, and it's good to have that option. But if that's the only way you can feel your feelings, it's like saying, I can only poop if my friends come in the bathroom with me. It's like stinky. It's like not great for everyone. So I think that part of what can be really empowering for people is learning all of these neutral, accessible, unbiased ways to create that amplification for yourself, and learn the practices of bringing your awareness in, finding the pain, learning how to talk to the pain or become the pain enough to move the pain and then recover from the pain. Those are the tools.
Oh man.
And that's exactly what anyone who buys this gets. Like, it's just like the map of that. This is the book.
Listeners, you have my permission to pause the episode and go to Amazon and download or order your copy immediately. So what the question that popped up for me is, we have a lot of conversations about like, don't stuff your feelings. And I think sometimes people can be fearful that if they don't express the emotion in the moment that it's happening, then they're stuffing it instead of potentially like saving it for later. Could you talk a little bit about
such
that?
a good question. Yeah. So there are two types of emotional release intelligence or skill that come online when someone does this. The first one is reactive, and that's like something happened in your day. Life squeezed you in some way and your feelings want to come out, right? You're triggered, something happened to you, you're triggered. And so the, emotionally potty trained, responsible, appropriate way to handle that would be, what is the soonest way I can go appropriately have this feeling without hurting myself or others? So it means, and we do that, unsurprisingly, we do that when we have to poop. If I had to poop during this, interview, I'm not going to do it in my chair. I'm going to be like, it is not the time to poop right now. I need to get myself, if it was the unavoidable time to poop, I would pause the episode, right? Like, so it's the same with feelings. Like if I were to get hit with shame while having this conversation with you, it wouldn't be the moment to really indulge and, draw out and release and cry and scream about my shame. We're doing something else right now. So, hopefully I would have a response in the moment to be like, kind of subtly say to that part of me, I see you, I'm going to come to you as soon as I can. And then as soon as you can. And if you're in the middle of your workday, it might be as simple, you go to the bathroom and shake or stomp, or you take a walk, or you mutter, it's amazing how much we can change our state by simple things like shaking is a good one, especially for fear. So that's reactive. And, I don't think it's shoving it at all. It's kind of being a grown up with it, right? The proactive move is more what I was talking about creating these containers or rituals or a practice. And it's much harder. And this skill set usually comes on after. Like usually people are like, oh, you want me to feel my feelings? Cool, I'm in for it. And then they'll get a feeling and they'll get good at allowing it or naming it or noticing it and then moving it, having it. The proactive is like, you're just having a good day. You might not feel triggered at all. You might be a little triggered, but like not so much that it's like coming out, you still need to go and actually turn toward it and, almost excavate it and draw it up. And this kind of practice is really important if you're going after healing your core wounds. And we can talk about those as like, what are those? What do I mean? But like the kinds of things that are buried and that are a result of kind of our earliest pre-verbal conditioning. Like if you don't create time to dig up the past, it's like it's hard to get to that place where you've cleared out the backlog. And it's much harder because if you're feeling good, you don't necessarily want to dig up your core shame but I think, I encourage people at most to do like 2 to 3 proactive sessions a week. So it's not something, the goal isn't to just constantly be digging up your emotional shit. It's like to deal with it when you need to and to start to, in a contained way, go after these deeper wounds.
So why don't we head in that direction then when we're talking about what core wounds are and then how to create a container? Like what does that look like? Because I imagine thinking about the overwhelmed, overworked, overstressed person saying
Oh,
2
yeah.
to 3 times a week. Is
Yeah.
each of these sessions like 4 hours? I don't even have time to go to the gym.
Oh,
I
no.
don't have time, like,
Yeah.
so let's talk
Right.
about like the core wounds
Okay.
and then shift into what that practically
Great.
looks like.
So core wounds, so basically I talked about how we all have wounding from our early life due to our human parents. And basically what happens is we come into this life completely vulnerable and dependent. We can't hold our head up. We don't have thoughts yet. We don't have thinking. And we are little animals. We're biological creatures. And one of the things about animals is like we want to live, like we are wired to survive. It's like we want to exist. And so little baby animals know, especially dependent ones like us. I mean, we're some of the most dependent animals that exist, right? We know we need the people who brought us, like who are around us, our caregivers. We need them to survive. And so, like, little tiny babies are really tracking what keeps mom or dad close. Like, we want
Hmm.
praise, but in the early days, we want like just closeness. We want food and shelter. We want proximity. And so, if every time you were to cry as a kid, your mom got glassy eyed or distant, or every time you expressed a desire or you got emotional, someone, and this probably happens a little later, like said, what's wrong with you? You're fine. Why are you taking up so much space? Or if you started getting shamed about this quality or that quality. Generally speaking, we are wired to do whatever it takes to not express those qualities because we would lose the connection. And so people will actually repress, aspects of themselves. And they're usually the most vulnerable, sensitive aspects of themselves because, those are the ones. It's like most parents are going to be like, wow, you're smart, you're athletic, so great. You play by yourself for an hour. You're so, it's like we get praised more often for our strengths. And so, but the parts of us that make us needy or are our needs, I don't mean needy in a pathologized way, are generally harder for caregivers to deal with. So, and then you add in, so that happens in your family, whatever that looked like, and of course there's a range of how healthy parents are as far as how much they can allow their kids to be who they are. Then you picture middle school, high school. For kids nowadays, social media, like there are so many ways that we're conditioned out of our authentic expression to try to get love and approval. And because it started immediately based on the biology of vulnerability, like we don't really understand it. It's like there might be a part that feels like it's unsafe to cry or it's unsafe to be big or a better way to understand, like a common response to that would be like a child who has a parent who's incapable of really making the child's experience at the center is going to become a little, they might call themselves an empath later because they had to turn their sensitivity out to look for safety or to actually keep the parent safe as a means of surviving. And so people, are fragmented and feel like imposters and have a lot of, generally speaking, maladaptive coping strategies like being a martyr or a people pleaser or a caregiver or acting like, unemotional or invulnerable when they're not. And so those are the wounds. And the reason they're wounds is that because they would have caused us to lose love when we're little and we push them away, the metaphor I use is into the emotional basement closet, and they're isolated and then we're fearing that they'll emerge. Like those parts end up feeling like little monsters and ghouls and gremlins. And they feel like what make us unlovable. And unfortunately, and this is the really cool thing to understand, like, we see people at the pinnacle of their career ending their lives, whether through suicide or overdose. And I think part of it is like you try, maybe if I succeed more, I'll feel like I'm good enough. If I get enough validation, I won't feel bad. There's no way to not feel bad other than pulling in the parts that feel bad and learning how to feel bad. Like, that's the only way to feel better, is to learn to feel as bad as you feel, right? But so, like, it's a good question. Like, why do these people with like glowing lives, who you'd think you would look at and think, oh, they have it all, they're so great, why do they think that they're not good enough? Like, why is it that almost everyone we know has some part that's like, am I okay? Am I enough? And it's because in those early days, let's say there was like some instability or lack of support from the parents, a child would have essentially two choices. And this isn't like a multiple choice, like this wasn't a verbal thing, but they could either be like, wow, I am an innocent little baby, and the people keeping me safe are unreliable. So what that would look like in kid speak is me good, world bad, world unsafe. So that's pretty scary if you take a breath with that. I'm innocent, but the people I depend on are not, and the world is unsafe. The other option we have is, and it's usually supported by what we're being told. Clean your room, do better, is I'm bad, and if I'm better, then the world will be safe and good, right? And so it's actually more adaptive as a tiny person to think that it's your fault versus realize you're helpless, right? And so before we even know words, there's some part of us that's like, what do I have to do to get the love? And it's, should I be better? Should I be different? And so that is the core wound. It's this like, deeply buried part that is absolutely positive that everything else you're doing that's great is a cover up for the truth of your being, which is you're not good enough. And it's pervasive. I think everyone has one. I've met one person who didn't. And she grew up on a miso farm, so.
Wow. I just want to take a moment to sit with how it felt to hear you put words to this sensation of being in that state of being an innocent, helpless child, and knowing intuitively that it's not safe for me to assume about the world, that something's off out there, that it has to be in here. I just want to sit for a moment with
I got
how
chills.
it feels to hear that, and to recognize that it wasn't a choice that we did that. And so that seems to me, the recognition of that seems to me like a very important first step to unshaming, because they're the parts of ourselves that we have believed are the gremlin little monsters. We can't ever look at those or let those out if there's shame there. And so just even the recognition that we didn't choose to put them in the basement is incredibly helpful for us to start looking there.
And that was the best choice.
Yes.
That was the best choice, was to assume it's your fault and to repress those parts. That's you didn't have the wherewithal, to do it the other way. The other way might have been worse, right? Yeah.
Oh gosh, wow.
And I do think, I agree. And I think it really helps. That's like in an early chapter, an early episode. My season 1 of my podcast is just a audio version of this like map also. It's like, as soon as I'm like, hey, let's look at the environment we're in now, we go to that, which is like, how did we get so wounded? And why does everyone have this feeling? And I do think there's this like, aha, like, oh, of course it's normal. We all have this. That's how it made sense to get this. But interestingly, like, and, I don't know that this is, maybe it will come up in the second question you asked me around, like, well, how do you build the structure around it? But what's fascinating, and I'm really obsessed with teaching this one piece, because it's almost the piece that I think is really unique to my approach, is naming it in this way. It's like, because a lot of the therapeutic modalities and self-help and mindset modalities kind of get that, like, however we came to be was our best attempt. And there's a lot of like scaffolding around trying to see the parents or the environment as more the culprit. And so to help people have compassion for themselves, which is an important step of the healing journey. However, you know how I just said, like, those parts are like bone deep, certain that like they are the truth and the rest is the cover up. until we learn the skills to actually let those parts experience the pain as true without talking ourselves out of it, we walk around with the pain. That is the catch.
Oh man.
And that's why I think, like, part of where I'm coming from is I think most of the people healing themselves are at like 60% and compensating. Kind of like how I said, like, I was a good therapist living a good looking life for like a full decade before I actually felt well inside. It's because in order to actually heal those parts, they have to be found, allowed, brought back in, and then you have to realize it is you. You're still holding that pain and you still believe it. And you have to release the pain. The pinnacle of release comes from becoming the part that is positive, you're unlovable, not dismissing it, not scaffolding it, not trying to like reality test yourself out of it. And then at the end of a release that comes from that depthful, like, I'm the worst release kind of, then you come into like reality testing is what I call it, but like what would be more like it wasn't actually true that you were unlovable. And so what's interesting is like this whole work is really guiding people to a place where they can actually finally not dismiss that pain, but feel it as truth and release it as truth with the compassionate wisdom and witness of the part of them choosing to feel it. It's like, and so it's, yes, in the beginning, you need to know it wasn't your fault that you chose that, or that was the best choice, or was like a nonverbal, biologically wired choice. Then eventually you have to like really like let yourself become that excruciating pain. And which is, it's possible, it's hard, it's doable. And it's like the relief is tremendous.
Yeah, I can imagine. How important is it for us to have explicit memories? Because myself and a lot of people are like, I don't remember that much about my childhood. How can I
Yeah.
still address these core wounds if I'm like,
Yeah.
something happened back there, I'm sure.
Yeah. It's a really good question. And the answer is yes, you can still heal. I don't really recommend thinking too much in my approach, but the one place I think it is useful to reflect on your childhood. And I ask various questions around like things like, how do you compare yourself if you had siblings? Like, how did you think like for instance, when I was little, I think I was like really like academically sound, a little athletic. My sister was like much more trusting and relational. So I was like, what makes someone good, quote unquote, was like someone who's like really good at relationships. So I was like distrusting and kind of like separate. And she thought what makes someone good is being smart and athletic. So it's like, those are signs of like, what did you not think was okay about you? Or, like, what did your parents value? What were you taught made you good or not good? And then also like, what did you learn to hide? Like, and you can look at your current life too. Like if you were to be dating someone new, like what would you try to like give a lot of caveat before you tell them this thing about yourself? Is it that you're too sexual? Is it that you're not sexual enough? Do you feel like you're not smart enough? That you're, whatever, like at the end of the day, it always comes down to you're bad or you're wrong, and you're either like too much or not enough. It's like, and I do think you'll hear this in my book and on my approach. It's like the simpler the language we use, the more likely we will feel things, and breaking things down. Sometimes if a client's really in their head and they tell me some elaborate story, I'm like, tell me that as a kid would say it. Because the simpler we get, the more we can kind of like GPS locate these parts, because they're very young and they speak in like pretty basic language. And so, you don't need an elaborate memory of like what exactly it was. It's just about like finding the part that might feel like it's not enough or it's bad, it's not lovable, and like just getting a sense of the, how come, like, or the why. I don't generally use why as in my approach either, because it's always, we only ask each other why when we're implying that whatever the thing is shouldn't be. Like if I was like, all right, I'm going to go to work next, you wouldn't be like, why? You'd be like, Rachel's a grown up. You might not know it's because I bought a house I don't live in, and so I can't stop working because I have 2 bills to pay. But you wouldn't ask me why, But if I was like, I'm sad today, you might say why. And so there's this implication that, but I do think asking why you felt unlovable is helpful, or how you felt unlovable is helpful. And then, I give all kinds of strategies for when you're, the whole first step of emotional potty training is about these parts, and it's about courting the parts back into our awareness. And so if you know that like you went through a really awkward phase at like 6 or 8, or you felt really like gross or whatever, like maybe when you grew boobs, or for me, I remember, I like figured out how to like have, sensual pleasure in my body way before I was ready to, because I like was like, I'm gonna do this everywhere, and then like felt so ashamed. By 7, I was like, please don't bring up my childhood, which is so sad because I was a child. But anyway, there might be a time where you were like, ooh, that was where I feel like the badness kind of came online. And so finding a picture of yourself that like roughly correlates to that part of you in your mind, putting it on your home screen, like making an altar in your house, putting little alarm reminders on your phone to check in with little, Morgie or like Rachie, and starting to track, what do these parts of you actually feel throughout the day? Who do they like in your life? Who are they really stressed around? That's how we start to court these parts back enough where we might be able to do one of these proactive sessions. And I am going to just go ahead and address that question. So, what is the overwhelmed person? I feel you. I get it. I mean, I just came through the most stressful 6 months of my life with like, the build up to this book coming out and a TEDx the following week, which is where we met. That was so fun. And a retreat. I was just like super flooded. And it's not that I'm in an acute healing phase, but I will tell you that I got a little less, I was a little slappier emotionally without having as much time to slow down and move things, just got a little bit more leaky, I'd say, with the feels. But yeah, if you're living as an adult, if you have a house, if you have a job, if you're trying to be healthy enough to listen to a show like this, I'm sure you're already maxed out. And what I will say, as far as the motivation to try to incorporate this, and there are ways to blend it with other things like working out or nature time or bathing, like, there's a lot of strategies depending on what feeling you're trying to move that you could like kind of build it into other things you do. But like the reality is like you could go to the gym every day and have like a 6-pack and like the perkiest little butt or whatever the thing is you're working on, and still kind of feel ugly inside until you learn to connect to the part of you that feels ugly and let it feel ugly. And then, so it's almost like I think we're always choosing how to spend our time. And so and what's interesting is I think you'll be even busier when you're kind of desperately trying to outrun this nagging sense of not feeling good enough, because you're probably in more self-help stuff and doing more like, whether it's like you're like the star PTA mom, because that makes you feel like you're good enough. It's like, so if you're going to just look at like, well, if you still have that nagging feeling, maybe just carving out, and I would say it would start with like 20 minutes at a time, just because it takes us a while to like come in, right? 20 to maybe 45 minutes max, maybe an hour, definitely not 4 hours. And then you have to play with it. You have to play with, well, what enables me to connect? Like, do I want to do it in the bathtub with sad music playing? Or, okay, no, I feel a little more frenetic and scared or angry. Like, okay, well, how do I move that in a way that's safe? Like it takes some troubleshooting in the beginning to figure out what works for you. But it's like, if learning to feel as bad as you feel actually makes you feel better and gives you more freedom and choice around what else you're doing, because you're not just doing it to outrun your demons and suddenly you don't have demons, I'd say there's like literally nothing more valuable.
Yeah, agreed.
Which doesn't mean it's easy to find time. And that's where you want to look at the strategies like, blending it into exercise or bathing or whatever. But it's possible and it's pretty valuable.
Yeah. How much do you think the physical movement plays into the emotional movement?
It's pretty huge. I mean, like part of part of why I use the poop metaphor, because I'll tell you, the publishing industry doesn't like it when you talk about poop. They're like, honey, all the old white ladies of the industry, they were like, we don't talk about poop. And I'm just like, God, I can't believe I'm going to die on this hill. I really am like, I'm going to die on this hill. But part of the medicine of that is like, it breaks it into something finite. It's like the body is like, it's the whole thing. Like it is the whole thing, because emotions, if you take off the E of motion, they are moving things. They are sensations. Like, if you're angry, you might have an energetic feeling of like heat rising, heat kind of expanding. You have tension in your limbs or your face or your fists. It's like, it's a physical thing. If you're sad, they talk about heartache, heartbreak for a reason. There's like a heavy collapsing, pooling feeling. It's like, fear is so physical, anger is so physical, and so when we get that, there's a couple things. I said it's finite. Like, our thoughts are endless if you try to like understand or reflect on, and that's why you see people with gorgeous narratives about why they are how they are, but that are totally stuck. It's like the insight alone doesn't do much, So, but you can only pee so much, you can only poop so much. I mean, like, maybe you got food poisoning, you're going to be in a spell of like releasing, but like, we can only sleep so much, we can only eat so much. It's like the body has limitations in a way that's really useful. And so it's going to, simplify things, and you're just going to be following and supporting this kind of physical thing that will have an arc to it, where it will like peak and it will come down, and and you just build your capacity to allow your body's wisdom to do its thing. Like, our body is just full of like homeostasis maintaining mechanisms. And why would we not have that for like the sensing, energetic, emotion based part? Like, of course we do. But we just all like got in the way. So we're like, I'm not allowed to feel, feeling makes me a loser. Nope.
I really, really, really like what you said about the emotions being finite, but the thoughts being infinite, because it's so easy to really quickly attach the emotion to thought, and then away we go. And
Yeah.
I was reading a book the other day. It was called The User's Guide to the Brain, and it was talking about how when we close our eyes and we think about where something is in our kitchen, and we envision going to the cabinet and opening the cabinet door and reaching up and getting out the baking soda, for example, the same pathways light up in our brain as if we were actually moving to get the baking soda. And that was kind of a light bulb moment for me, where I was like, oh, our memories are intrinsically woven together with these motor pathways in our brain. And so it makes perfect sense that if we're going to also move emotion, that it would make sense to physically move something. And like the example that you gave already was to go into the woods and chop some wood down when you're feeling angry, or
well, not chop down a living tree, more like
right.
chip at a log
Yeah.
of a dead tree.
Perfect. But what made sense to me is when you're talking about, like, in the beginning, as you're kind of testing the waters and seeing what works for you, it sounds like the advice is then to see what physical activity helps move certain emotions. So like if I'm feeling like deep sadness, probably going out there and like at a dead tree is not the correlating movement, physical movement for that.
Right. Yeah. And some of it's more active. Like, here's another tip. Emotions are all basically like a version of two energetic patterns. One is explosive and one is implosive. So, anger, clearly explosive. I already said that. Sadness, implosive, right? Fear, as we know from talking about fight, flight, freeze. I don't include fawn as much because it's more about like a relational manipulation, but it can be both. Like, there is fear that will have you freeze, and that's more of an implosive thing. There's fear that's like really frenetic. And shame, I think, in its pure state is more implosive. Like, when you're feeling how bad and gross and unlovable you are, you're more likely to cry. But I do think to overcome shame, we have to like fight back against like these stories and beliefs and wounds that we've carried. So, and those are the feelings that I break down and teach people how to have. I do address happiness in the book. I didn't in the podcast. But more just like to break the sad news that I'm not going to try to get you to bliss. I'm going to try to get you to a more moderate contentment kind of place. And to look at like how to deal with like extreme states of bliss when they're natural, and how to understand the parts of us that generally pendulum swing from like, shitty feelings to bliss or some version of a high. But so, if every feeling is either an explosion or an implosion, or a combination, and they often change. Like you might start feeling how angry you are at your mom and you're beating your bed, or you're like throwing your heavy medicine ball, or you're muttering and you're swearing, and suddenly you get a wave of like ache or heartache that you didn't feel her love, or that you've always like longed for something. So the goal is you start with where you are, but then you're just following the like emerging thing. So like even if you set up to do a release in a certain way and you thought, I'll try this movement, you want to just keep with the shape as it changes. But it makes it like fairly less overwhelming. And I know there are magnets like that have 30 feelings. Like, how do you feel? I know that Brene Brown, I think in more of her recent work, has been talking about like the importance of naming an emotion just right. I don't actually agree with that for the purpose of feeling and healing. I think the simpler the better, because the point of the feelings in this way is about having them, and which means it's about being in the body and sensing the thing. If you're writing poetry, if you're trying to communicate with someone, maybe that nuance matters more. But so like, with sadness, it's, what I suggest is it's really about containment. How do you create a experience? Sadness is probably the least physical in a way, meaning you have to move. Like the implosive feelings, usually more it's about like feeling held enough to kind of like get the inner thing to unlock and move. But it's like this is where you want to remember bandwidth. What's going to give you the strong enough connection to the feeling, the bandwidth enhancement. And so it might be music, it might be nature, it might be water, it might be heavy blankets, might be petting yourself, and but with the more frenetic and active feelings, moving is so helpful. And if you're feeling like disconnected from your body and like you can't feel yourself, like a walk, a run, exercise, like any kind of moving your body, shaking things up, and from like a visceral state, tuning in. And I do try to give examples with all of the feelings for people who are less mobile. There is still a way to work with every feeling you have, even if and I bet most listeners are like, go into the woods and chop wood. And absolutely, you should have that reluctance. If you don't know how to use an axe, it's not probably legal where you live. Like, it's very complicated. I've had all kinds of funny encounters, but there are lots of pretty low effort ways to do this, like low mobility ways, but it's simpler than we think. And that does not make it easy.
Yeah, that's a good point. I really like the distinction that you're making between being able to name the emotion and being able to feel the emotion, because that's one of the questions that I had right off the top of this episode is the healing trap for deep thinkers, or for people who tend to intellectualize things. And I can be very good at being like, I have this feeling, I'm going to go find a book about it, and that's one of my challenges is to not right away click into how do I think about this differently, but instead how do I actually feel it. Can you talk about
they're very different. Well, first of all, I'm a thinker too. I mean, that was my first line of escape from this intolerable pain. And I would say it is the most popular defense mechanism is to intellectualize. So, some might do it more than others, but it's funny. And I've had people be like, I was reading your book and I loved it. And then you started telling me I had to do stuff. And so I put it down, it's like, and I just beg the reader, like, don't just keep reading about these different things. Try it. I mean, it's so precious that we have these like brains that are so curious and can get all nuanced and so fun. Like, I love humor and puns, and it's like I have quite an active brain, but it's just like kind of getting that like the parts that need me aren't up there, and they don't speak complex, they're like young, and they're and like that the things that need to happen, the closer we can stay to our bodies. And a lot of the way I work with people in therapy, so people come in and they have all kinds of like social like masks and ways of speaking that disconnect them from themselves. Like, they come in, how are you? And I'm like, I've been joking, I'm like a therapeutic dominatrix. In fact, like one day I was like, I'm doing that too intensely. I need to be gentler. I can't tell someone to not ask me how I am so quick. And then I had the first session with someone, like the day, 2 days later. And they were like, how are you? The first time they're seeing me, they had like known about me. They were so excited. And I was like, basically was like, don't ask me how. But anyway, I mean, like, I'm always I'm trying to trim away, you know, with whatever degree of grace I can muster, not just come in too hard. But like all of the things, like people saying that they're sad while smiling, or that's pervasive, you know, people, you know, making everything pretty, putting a bow on things. A big one for someone who wants to get away from their experiences, people say, you know, and then you were like, I went to this thing, or like I went through this trauma, and people, you know, that like if you go through this and you do this, you're talking about yourself, but you're saying you. And so nobody, I try to like wait to get through the first session before I introduce people to the I game. But like everyone working with me is playing the I game. I act like they have a choice, but I'm like, if you want to work with me, you have to play the I game, which is, you know, and once people start doing this, you're going to notice in your life who does this, right? Like I had to work really hard to not tell dates to say I instead of you, but it's really confusing. I feel confused when I'm with someone and they're like, well, you know, you're like this or you're like this. And I'm like, are you talking about me or you? You know, and when someone speaks about themselves, if someone knows how to say, I feel this, I feel that, even in response to when you said that, I felt this, I feel safe and dropped in and curious. If someone's going to say, well, you're like this or you're like that, even if it's like, are you talking about you or me? Or if they're talking about something that happened between us, but they're not naming their experience, then I feel more defensive. So a huge thing of like, how do we stop thinking, really like, it's slightly different than intellectualizing, but how do we get closer to what's actually happening? That's like what's underneath. I think the question is like, how do I come out of my maze and into the direct experience? And saying I will do wonders, and noticing, when do you say you, and can you say it again with I? And I've watched people go from like they feel nothing to I'll be like I, and they'll say it again. I tell them I'm not scolding them. I'm inviting them to say it with ownership. And in the second time, they might start crying. It's like to actually get, this is my experience. This happened to me. This is how I feel, will bring them closer to their experience. And part of that, I just made a video about this today. That's what creates agency. And Gestalt therapy, which was my first approach or my first training, they say that agency is the sign of health. It's like knowing, when am I thirsty? When am I hungry? Like you're in a resting state and then a need emerges or a desire emerges, and you meet the need or the desire, and then you come back to this resting state. That's what a Gestalt means. It's like this overall moment that in any moment a need or something will arise, right? And we can't follow our needs if we're not in ourselves. So being close to our experience is how we learn to take care of our experience. And knowing that we have choice and agency and can take care of ourselves is what creates that sense of resilience and safety to be who we are in the world, which we know is not safe.
I think one of the big fears, like I could speak to my experience as a parent, is I hear a lot of noise about don't raise entitled children. You know, don't address every need that they have, teach them how to be independent. And so it's like finding this balance between how do I raise children that are definitely in tune with how they're feeling, and teaching them skills how to move emotions through their bodies, and also that sometimes you don't get what you want,
No,
and
right.
that you know, and that you have to do things that don't feel good just
Yeah.
to be a member of society. And it's a really difficult path to walk, and the
Yeah.
thing that makes it even more difficult is the outside perspective on how I'm doing.
Yeah,
It's
all of
really
those
difficult to
voices.
navigate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well then, you know, I hear you, and I'll just name, I'm not a parent, and it's clear that I don't want to be in this life. I'm going to help the people who are here, but it's a really hard path. So I'm like, I don't want to in any way say, oh, it's so easy. I mean, I would give an example, sitting with a child who's like, but I really want cake for breakfast. You know, it's like, yeah, I get that. Yeah, you do. You want cake and you're sad that you can't have cake for breakfast. I get that. Like, you're allowed to feel sad that I'm not giving you cake for breakfast is very different than saying, okay, you're feeling sad, I'm going to give you cake for breakfast. That's actually how we learn to get away from the feeling. Like, you know, do you want mommy to hold you while you're sad? Do you want to go take a minute in your room to like feel sad, and you can or you can tell us what you need. Like, you're allowed to be sad, it's like the point isn't, in fact, most of these feelings, like, if they're just allowed to come up, they will leave, and that is the solution. Like, just like our poop, like, we don't have to fix anything. You don't need to know what food went into that. You don't,
Mm.
and you never say, well, why do I need to go poop again? You're like, I guess I need to go poop again, and you go poop again, right? So it's not about like understanding or justifying or indulging or solving. It's about allowing the thing to come up and come out. And it's a really hard path. I think for you, what I would throw out based on what you just said is like, the more it's like, okay, if you have your own wounds of, am I a good enough parent, or am I doing a good enough job, and you're an over intellectualized, and you're going to go solicit information as an excuse or an alternative to feeling maybe the insecurity or fear that you're not a good mom, you're going to fill yourself with like 10 different viable options that will all seem compelling because they're all so adamant that that's the way. And what you've done is, like, there was a feeling or a need or a instinct in you that was scary and maybe too intense. So you went out and got information, but it's like we said, our minds are infinite and people's opinions are infinite. Whereas if you were like, oh, I'm scared, maybe I'm being a bad mom right now. Okay, let me feel the fear of that. Let me like hold the part of me that feels that, maybe I have a cry, maybe I do a little shaking for a few minutes. Maybe I ask myself, okay, given how scared I am about if I know what to do in this moment of parenting, what do I need? Okay, I need to take a walk. I need to call my friend who I really trust and just name that, like, I'm feeling sad and scared. If you can just tend yourself, like, your own wisdom will be there, and it will be clearer. And not to say you'll know the right thing, but I mean, like, isn't that just like, I'm like, as soon as you learn this, you're going to go in there and like play with it. Like, that's probably what, you know, trusting yourself as a parent looks like. It's like taking some strategy that feels true or like worth trying and seeing how it goes. And, but I think like I would trust your deep instincts after you've tended and cared for your fear way more than like, you know, your ability to synthesize 10,000, it's like everyone, and, I'm not saying we don't need information. We do, like for instance, like I don't think this information of how to really digest feelings was available and is now, more available, but it's like, we do need help sometimes. We do need maps, and I'm sure with like parenting, it's like helpful, but at the end of the day, if you're avoiding your own feeling or fear, uncertainty by scaffolding with all the opinions, you will be more confused after.
For sure. I just want to share with you like this. I'm tearing up because I just had this really beautiful shift on a memory that I have interpreted a particular way when my children were little. I can get, and I think a lot of parents will relate to this, not just parents, but like when there's a lot of noise and how it feels to be overstimulated in my own body is like I just like I want to crawl out of my own skin. And so
Hmm.
I remember when I just had two children, just and they were young, and there was the noise and the crying and the asking for things and the touching. And I remember one particular instance going into my bedroom, shutting the bedroom door, locking the door, going into the closet, shutting the closet, putting my hands over my ears and screaming.
Yeah.
And until just now, I have
Aw.
always looked back on that memory and said, I'm a bad mom because I did that. And
Mm,
like, oh man,
no.
okay, I'm gonna cry so much right now.
Please.
I just had this recognition that my ability to remove myself from the overstimulating situation and go into the
Yeah.
closet by myself and scream
And
meant
let it out.
that I was doing a good job.
Oh, absolutely. I
Oh
have
my
chills.
god, Rachel.
Woo! Yeah. And if you made a practice out of that, I mean, if you're raising kids, I think going into the closet to scream regularly sounds like a really good approach. That's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
It was the story that because I had the big overwhelmed feelings that I was a bad mom.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I just want to reiterate again for the people who are listening, the feelings don't mean anything about you. It just means that you're human, that you're having a feeling.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
the way that we spill those onto other people matters, and the
Yeah.
way that we the stories that we attach to the feelings that we have. And I think a big part of this is some of the challenge of feeling our feelings is when we've been told that certain feelings are bad,
Mhm.
or, in certain contexts, we've been told that they're sinful. And I wanted to ask you about anger in particular,
Mhm. Oh,
especially
yeah.
for a lot of women listening to this
Mhm.
who have carried the weight of the hysteria, the weight
Right.
of the angry, bitchy woman. And
Yeah,
can you
well, of
just
course, we're so
talk
much
for?
easier to control if we're not allowed to be angry.
Mm,
Isn't it fascinating that men who were prohibited from emotions, the one emotion they were allowed, and this is maybe more last generation than now, I do think it's changing, but men were allowed to be angry, but they weren't allowed to be sad. They weren't allowed to be
mm,
scared, right? Whereas I agree that there's more of a stigma about anger for women. It's a great question. Anger is the least understood emotion. And I think even by like, spiritual new age, even therapeutic approaches, like talking about anger management, that's what you
mm,
hear is
mhm,
managing anger. So my mentor, he really helped me connect to actually the nature, to like the natural world, and to connect our emotions to the elements. So, can you guess what element would be connected to anger?
probably fire.
Fire, right? Think about fire for a second. Now, we know fire is destructive, can tear down a city, could burn up your home. It needs care, but we cook with fire. Electricity uses fire. Our cars, you wield tools in fire. It's like fire is incredibly useful. It keeps us warm. We need it, but we learn to relate to it with care. So it's not just about like pushing it down or managing, but if you look at like some of the native approaches to land management, it's like
Mm,
there's like small contained burns that will keep a area of land from just being devoured by like a really destructive fire. You have your own little burns, right? So fire is not bad, right? It might be scary, it might be dangerous, and similarly, anger is not bad. And in fact, anger is one of the primary colors of emotion, meaning you can't get more basic. Like, there's no way to be a human or to have a, emotional, to look at the feelings that come up for people without anger. Anger is not a mistake. It's not a problem. It's not like your feelings are okay, but anger is not okay. Like, anger is one of the things that happens when you're a person. And if you have a healthy relationship with anger, meaning it's not backlogged and repressed and therefore super spring loaded, like when I talked about people pleasers or martyrs, that archetype, those people are like, I don't have any needs, you can walk all over me, and they're like giving their cookies to everyone around them, and then they're like rageful eventually that no one gave them any cookies back when they gave all their cookies away. It's like, and so fire does what it does, anger does what it does. Like, you can push your anger down for a certain amount of time, but one way or the other, it's going to explode because that's just what it is. The alternative side of that is someone who might be like overindulging in anger where everything makes them mad and they're like flipping birds and yelling and like, kind of unleashing fire onto people. So that's like the spectrum, right? Not being allowed to have it, or being, out of balance with it in one of those two extremes. And um, the anger work practice is like giving yourself permission to have anger, finding healthy, safe ways to move anger without hurting your body, without hurting other people, um, so that you can honor the parts of you that have anger. And someone with a healthy relationship with their anger, meaning they're not backlogged and they're not just spilling over with it, anger will become a really profound signal that something has transgressed a boundary, that something's not okay or not right. Um, and that's and it's also like infuses our sense of self-honoring. Like, in the beginning with anger work, a lot of people can only feel angry toward themselves, just like in the beginning, you feel like you're the problem, right? Even physicalizing anger toward yourself is a way of moving it out of your system, so it's still helpful. But for that person, the ability to be angry at someone else is actually going to be a sign of growth, right? Because it means you knew that you didn't deserve that thing that happened, right? So anger, it's profoundly transformational for me in my own healing journey. Um, I would say that like finding the strength, my mentor was like, I went out. So most of our work was on the phone. When I first met him, he lived in a mud hut. It's amazing. He had a phone there, right on the border of New Mexico and Arizona. But I would go out, I think I went out 4 or 5 times to his land, for these intensives. One of them was a 5-day intensive. I went by myself, and it was scary to go spend time with this guy. This guy was fierce. It was not comfortable. I was like shitting in a hole. Actually, like that time when I told him I was like nervous about going back for 5 days, because I poop a lot. That's part of like my obsession with poop, is like I've always been a really good pooper. But and his land's really flat, so it's kind of hard. Anyway, tight ankles, blah, blah, blah. He like made me a little like toilet in the earth. It was so amazing. But this last like intensive was just the 2 of us. A couple of days in, he was like, look, like your growth kind of got stuck when you were 14. You're like stuck as an adolescent, and you've been pedestalizing this dead kid, instead of realizing this kid attacked you and you need to fight back. And so that whole trip for me was built around bow drill, which I don't know if you've ever heard of bow drill, but bow drill is a primitive way to make fire. There's like hand drill. It's basically like fire by friction with wood. And like we use this like rite of passage, like trial of like me sitting with living tree and like harvesting dead tree of the same tree, cottonwood, which I have part of my tattoo on my arm, and then like carving with a knife, which was not my skill set. The first time I went out to learn this, he like wouldn't teach me how to use my knife because he said I wasn't trying hard enough. I failed. He was like, you have to, if you're coming back, you have to try again. I'm like, no, not the bow drill. Anyway, carving this set and learning how to use my body to like bring forth this coal and then blow it into a tinder bundle, make fire myself from like start to finish. It was like amazing. That was like the crux of what I was doing while we were doing emotional release. And he was, part of his method was singing into the emotional wounds. He's like a healer in a different kind of way. Anyway, that trip, I really harnessed, really for the first time ever, my full rage, and like just like was chopping wood for hours, screaming, and was able to bring forth fire. And and it was probably the coolest thing I've ever done. And I've done some cool stuff still to this day. I think it was cooler to bring forth fire than to write a book and to give a TEDx talk and just travel the world alone, seeing my favorite band. Anyway, that was really the point, like this, like fighting back of like, I'm not going to live the rest of my life feeling like there's something wrong with me or worthless sack of shit because you chose to trap me in your suicide plan, you little fuck, excuse me language. So it's like, it was a game-changing thing. And I think that like for most people, when you do this work and you find the parts that feel so deeply unlovable, like that fire that's like, no, not anymore. I'm not going to keep telling myself I'm a bad mom anymore. And you find it and you harness and you fight back using that fire. It changes everything. So it's like one of the least utilized, powerful components of transformation.
Can I ask just a few more questions about
Sure.
anger?
Yeah.
Particularly when it is directed towards someone else. I mean, that to me is like, okay, yeah, I can see how the anger directed towards ourselves, like that makes sense, and that could be allowed, quote unquote allowed. But that's, I think, where I was taught that anger had to stop. Like you could not, don't be angry at somebody else. And the place where I can get really wrapped up in my own head is like knowing that every person has those little gremlins, those little parts of ourselves that we've exiled, and that I move through the world with a belief that everyone is doing the best that they can with the tools that they have. And so sometimes that can get me into this empathy trap where I don't allow myself to get pissed at anybody ever.
Well, first of all, that makes sense. And I'm not suggesting that you harness your anger or you throw your anger at someone. Like when you're doing a private anger tantrum, you can be as pissed as you can sustain. For you, that will be hard to let yourself sustain anger, but you're not doing it at them. You're doing it at a log or at your bed or at a pillow or muttering. Like it's like giving yourself the privilege of having this. For you, it will feel like prohibited, naughty, you're like breaking the rules, private anger tantrum. But like once you do that, and maybe for some big moments you need to do it a couple times, and maybe you need to keep reminding yourself you're allowed to be angry while you're doing it because you lose the mojo. which will happen. Once you do that a few times, you take the charge and the edge off, and what will be left is like this clear sense of this is what I need to say to that person. And actually allowing ourselves to be angry enables more genuine empathy. Like, it doesn't mean that person's wrong or bad. It's like, what was the boundary violation? Like, what happened at that edge between you and this person? Like, and the goal is to like get to this place where you can clear things out like and get pretty sober, and then choose how to relate to the relational real external thing in a balanced way, versus like the goal isn't to just start unleashing on people.
Yeah.
That's probably already happening. And I wonder for you if like eventually you might be more of those like, well, I'm not allowed to have needs. I need to like always understand the other. Maybe your senses were having to go out more than into yourself as a little person. And so like my guess is you'd probably like push yourself down, push down, push down, push down, and then eventually like maybe unleash or write off a relationship because you never found the ways to like actually be a part of it, in a way where your needs mattered.
Yeah, I wrote down the word the spring-loaded emotion. I resonate a lot with that.
Yeah.
That metaphor of just pushing down, pushing down, pushing down, pushing down until like until it's inevitably going to open up.
Goes the weasel.
Yeah, no kidding. I really appreciate the distinction between having your own little private tantrum and having that publicly. And God, this metaphor of the potty training is brilliant.
Yeah.
Because it really does.
Thank you.
It really does normalize all the feelings so much and brings so much awareness to the appropriate times and places and paying attention to the urges. God, it's so good. It's so good, Rachel.
Thanks.
Before we go, do you have any last minute things that you would really like to convey to any of the listeners? And of course, I will link to all the ways that people can find you in your book and your work and your TED Talk and all of that in the episode notes. But any parting thoughts that you want to leave with us?
Yeah, well, first of all, it was really fun to connect with you. Thanks for having me on your show. And it was, I really just enjoyed meeting you. And it's an honor. I know what a big deal having a podcast and an audience is. And so thank you. And then, yeah, I think my parting thought is just like the fastest way to feel better is to learn how to feel how bad you already feel. It's just like, I can't say that enough. You've already tried all the other things like you did. If eating our way or performing our way or perfecting our way, validating our way, medicating our way away from this part worked, we wouldn't still have suffering. And so it's like, why not just learn to suffer with skill? And to, like you're saying, like to normalize that part of this human journey comes with these feelings and maybe they aren't the enemy. And then, yeah, I just think, everything about me is housed in the one place, thefeelingsmovement.com. I will say I have a retreat coming up. And for anyone who, particularly for parents, I know it's like the idea of getting away for 3 days as a parent is hard. But I think what's harder is the idea of like beginning a practice like this. And so I have found that like, these retreats, which I do in the desert down in Southern California, I have a house next to Joshua Tree. They are like, it's like the equivalent of 6 months or a year of the best therapy of your life. And it really focuses on helping people kind of dedicate the retreat to one of the parts that needs them the most, and then really practicing, like getting on the axe. Like we have an axe and a log, we have hot tubs, we have this gorgeous open field across the street where you can like go and throw rocks, and there's so much magic in the desert that like holds us, and really beautiful containment. So if anyone's like, I want to do this, but I cannot imagine how I would start, or I would need help, I would say that is one of the most powerful things you can do. And you will leave with a different relationship with your feelings and with the part of you that needs to have feelings. So, and it's in March 20th to 23rd. So it's pretty soon. And I do have some spaces left. So it's just an exciting opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you very much for making time to talk with me today and for so openly sharing all the things that you have learned personally and professionally. So I appreciate it. And for all my listeners, before we go, P.S.